Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. Today we have a seminar which is going to follow a format that we don't normally follow. Normally we have two speakers or one speaker speaking. Today we'll have Associate Professor Yuan speaking for about 30 minutes roughly, and then Professor Paul Evans will serve as a commentator based on what Professor Yuan has spoken about.
So we have 1.5 speakers.
Yeah, sort of, yeah. 1.5 speakers. So moderator counts for 0 actually, but yeah. So I don't want to go through the speakers' bios because they're already there. Suffice to say that Professor Yuan has been working on Asia Pacific security for a long time, and of course Professor Paul Evans doesn't need any kind of introduction. So why don't we start off, and then 30 minutes, Professor Yuan, and then Paul can come in for about 10 minutes. Right, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Dr. Singh. And also I'd like to thank the Institute of South Asian Studies for hosting this seminar. So what I'm going to talk about today is actually part of a larger project, which I should confess that has been delayed for a very long time. So this is a book project for Palgrave Macmillan. They specifically want me to look at China's perspectives because when you look at China's foreign policy agendas, most attention would be paid to China's great power relations with the United States, East Asia, Southeast Asia. But not sufficient attention has been paid to South Asia. Well, where South Asia is concerned is more about China-Indian relations. And so that, you've got a lot of writing going on. And also a bit of China-Pakistan, not maybe about 10% of what's been written on China-Indian relations. And then you move to China-South Asia, the other 5 or 6 smaller states, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bhutan, Nepal, all these smaller states, is even little attention there. So this book will, of course, talk about China-Indian relations, Pakistan, but also focus on China's growing presence in the Indian Ocean and China's relations with the South Asia. So this paper or seminar presentation today is to open with China's relations with India, to set the background, to set the scene, and then to talk about a number of issues in a very preliminary fashion because I'm still doing the research. And so basically to raise some questions. There are a number of those questions, and so I will elaborate, later on. So these are the key points. One is, of course, the rise of China has changed fundamentally. I think geopolitical and specifically in this part of the world, Indo-Pacific. In particular, perhaps is more of a geo-economics, but increasingly also geopolitics as well. And then I'll move into China-Indian relations. I mean, this is a relationship that, from either way you look at it, you could be extremely alarmed or you can be quite comfortably, confident that the bilateral relations would be pretty much manageable, even though they have unresolved issues, in particular territorial dispute for a very long time. And then I will touch on very briefly China-Pakistan's so-called all-weather relationship and emphasize the nature of that relationship is changing a little bit, especially from China's perspective, and the Chinese priorities and interest in keeping this relationship certainly are not the same as when this special relationship started in the early 1960s. Right? Then I moved into China-Indian Ocean and perhaps talk a little bit about China-Sri Lanka relations, what China has been doing in Sri Lanka and why is that a concern for India. And I will conclude with some general observations there. Now, I pretty much summarize sort of Sino-Indian relations in some T's, some M's, and some C's. Right? So, I mean, the T's are, you have territorial dispute, right? And you have threat perception, you have Tibet issues. Even where you can think about economic interdependence, positive aspect, I would argue that this is the bright spot in bilateral relations since 1988. You have increasingly the problems of trade imbalance. Right? So increasingly you have those problems. So even trade is part of that T there. And then you have several triangles, China, India, and the United States, and regionally China, Pakistan, and India. To some extent, China, Russia, and India, but that's not. But so you have all these triangular relationships. So all of these T's generate some sort of AMS misapprehension, misperception, which can lead to miscalculation, and so that could be a problem. So what both countries need really are a number of C's. So if you follow the development of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I mean, they talk a lot about the Shanghai spirit. It's based on a lot of those C's. So communication, confidence building, consultation, and then to develop, I think in recent years, certainly, if not by the two countries themselves, certainly by others, which assign them into sort of the emerging market. But of course, there's the BRICS there, the five emerging markets, and then they both are in G20, where they probably share some common interests and goals there, and so cooperation and for win-win outcome. So this I will skip. Just suffice to say, these are the outstanding problems. So when you look at China, India, so these are the issues you have to encounter, and so some are under control, some are in constantly tit for tat, back and forth. But I think in general trend, certainly from the government's official position, they both want to develop a cooperative relationship, because for both countries, their priorities are economic development, sustainable economic development, and to lift the people's living standards. And now China started economic reform in the late 1970s and early 1980s. India is about 12, 13 years behind. Early 1991, the former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, when he was the finance minister, so the opening up there as well. I mean, the last 2 years, India actually has maintained a faster growth rate than China. China's both years, 2014, 15, under 7%. India, I think last year, 2015, is about 7.545, and so, and India has other unique advantages as well. Now, over the last 10 years, certainly since Manmohan Singh's government, even before Vajpayee government, the BJP, the first previous government from the late 1990s, after the nuclear test, so 1 year, so relationship was kind of frozen, but then very quickly, since 2000, you could see there are a lot of regular high-level visit summit between the leaders of two countries. When Li Keqiang became the Chinese premier in 2013, he chose India as his first country foreign trip. So put a lot of emphasis there. And then, of course, there were multiple visits back and forth. And last 2 years, 2014, Xi Jinping went to India in September, and Modi extended a home sort of welcome in his hometown, and Xi returned favor by hosting Modi in Shanxi, in Xi'an, Xi's hometown. So there's a lot of those activities. Now, trade developed quite extensively, although they started from very low base. I mean, you just look at before the Rajiv Gandhi's visit in 1988, which is the year before that, 87. So it's just around $117 million, for two countries of 40% of the world population. So that's very, very low. That grew to the high point of $74 billion in 2011. Right? Just think about it. We had the global financial crisis 2007 and 8, but the trade continued. But the last few years, I think there's a decline. And increasingly, the problem is the trade deficit. Now, I think India, China, and India, Russia are two singular cases where the leaders project a growth target, but they were not able to meet the target. If you look at all the other China's bilateral trade arrangement, China South Korea, China ASEAN, every time they set a target, they will achieve the target ahead of the time, but not for China, Russia, and China, India. Just point. And since 2003, two governments have decided to move the border negotiation to a higher level by appointing special representatives. So 18 rounds of meetings have been held, but nothing really has been moving forward there. But then, in the regional context, I'll return to, there are still some problem issue there. But if you move beyond South Asia to the global arena, and you'll find China, India share a lot of common interests, and then they cooperate on the global forum from climate change, labor standards, basically the very unique sort of developing country perspectives. So you can see a very quick snapshot of the trade imbalance between the two countries. For India, the longer it trades with China, the larger the trade deficit. So that has been a perennial problem, and how you deal with those problems. In my other sort of research, I look at the economic patterns, and certainly over the last few years, India has been open up to Chinese investment. So some of Chinese companies move into India, so that to sort of compensate for this trade imbalances. But still, there are issues there as well. So basically, to conclude, they have, the two countries have challenges, but in overall terms, I think this is a mature relationship, even though I think sometimes, I don't know if it's because of conspiracy, you can find it. Every time there are major important visits by leaders, and then you read from the press all these incursions. And in fact, because you have differences over the boundary, you have a big gap of territory. Both sides would claim, China will claim to the south of that line, and India will claim to the north of that line. So it's quite natural for the Indian troops and the PLA troops to move into those areas where they still have no consensus on a final demarcation. And then the media will pick up and report those incidents at those particular time of leaders' visit. But other than that, I think the relationship could be considered to be quite stable. And now to Pakistan, of course, this relationship started in the early 1960s, and at the time when both China-Indian relations and Pakistan-Indian relations were at very low point. Now China has offered Pakistan huge amount of defense articles, equipment, weapon systems. You can say anywhere between $8 to $10 billion over many years, several decades, and certainly Pakistan's main suppliers of weapons system are the United States and China. China has been more consistent in supplying arms. The U.S. is basically switch on and off, and it depends on the circumstances. But over the last, I think, 15 years, especially since the 9/11, and China's interests are shifting toward secure its northwestern border and securing, maintain stability in the northwestern part of China. So there, China would value a greater role that the Pakistan can play in terms of helping stem the flows back and forth, the separatist or what the Chinese call terrorist groups' activities. And China does not want to see India-Pakistan, conflict, because if it comes to blows, and then China is somehow obligated because of this special arrangement. But in recent years, certainly, China is encouraging Pakistan to manage its relationship with India through diplomacy, but put more focus on economic development, because all the insurgents, social instability are a result of the lack of economic development. So I will mention the very ambitious China-Pakistan economic corridor, a lot of investment. I mean, the numbers are huge, but I'm not sure exactly where those numbers are coming from. All right, so, but suffice to say, I think the core elements, because there's inertia there. So even though Chinese priorities have changed, there are certain special ties between the Chinese military and Pakistan military, and security apparatus continue. And certainly China does not want to see Pakistan disintegrated into a country of not secular control, become more radicalized. So that will undermine China's interest. So how to sustain the all-weather ties, to expand beyond defense cooperation, especially economic cooperation there, infrastructure development. So there's this China-Pakistan economic corridor, $46 billion investment commitment from China when Xi Jinping was visiting Pakistan last year. But if you look at the overall economic interactions between two countries are not showing, this is a sort of a relationship of any, in economic terms, of any significance as far as China is concerned. Very low trade levels, and they are compared to India, and certainly it's very, very low. Now, recent development, infrastructure, the highway, basically to amend, modify the highway, the Friendship Highway, but the most important one is the Gorda Port development since the 2001. So here's the very ambitious project. Now, there's the catch-22 here. So for the project to be successful, you need very stable sort of environment, right? But because the lack of economic development, you can't achieve stability. So you need to have some injection of funds and to develop the infrastructure and then to bring about economic development. But then you have to face a lot of disruptions and holding hostage, killings. So all of these create problems for the management of those very ambitious projects. So how it will go, we'll see in the next few years. So if you look at China's policy as far as the two major players in South Asia is a more balanced approach, although I would point out that the Indian security analysts would argue that this is not the case. So this is, I think, one of the challenges for the Chinese diplomacy is how you can dehyphenate the India, Pakistan, and China's relationship with these two countries, and then really to convince India that the China-Pakistan relationship is has its own merit, is bilateral. In that sense, is not something that that India should be concerned and worried about. But so far, I think China has not been able to convince New Delhi that is the case. So into South Asia, it's basically, from Chinese perspective, one could argue that China has established diplomatic relations with most of the other South Asian countries, starting in the early 70s. Sri Lanka even earlier, 1957. Right? Bangladesh, after the first few years, China blocked the country's entrance into UN. In mid-1970s, China and Bangladesh established diplomatic relations and very stable relationship. And in the last 15 years, I think as Chinese economy continued to on a upward trajectory, there's a greater demands and need for raw materials, energy, resources. And so Indian Ocean becomes a very important ceiling of communication for China. Therefore, Chinese interest is growing in Indian Ocean. One of the concern is about this the disruption, potential possible disruption of the routes through which 84% of China's oil imports and raw material go through Indian Ocean, Hormuz, the Middle East, the Persian Gulf, through Indian Ocean, through the Strait of Malacca, to the major industrial arteries in China, Shanghai, East Coast, and so forth. So China, over the last 15 years, is trying to develop and help several of the Indian Ocean littoral states to develop or improve port facilities and infrastructure to create alternative future sort of routes for those to transport those critical resources. So that gets into what Indians consider to be a strategic sphere of influence there. And I think so far there are more rhetorics, perceptions, and the scholars may put more, emphasize or amplify the problem where I think at the official level you don't see a very public statement to that effect. But obviously, for India in particular, it is paying more attention. China is coming. Not only the economic influence, but with the economic influence is the diplomatic influence, and perhaps also military presence in this part of the world is considered to be Delhi's sphere of influence. 2005, there's a major study, quite influential, this string of pearls of looking at all the Chinese port development in Myanmar, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and how these could develop as potential future naval facilities for the PLA Navy. So why Chinese interests already mentioned. Now, several of those key facilities, Gorda and then Chittagong in Bangladesh, and Hambantota and Colombo City Port. So these are two major facilities in the range of $1.4 and $1.5 billion, and so massive infrastructure development there. So there is a competition going on. So China is building ports and helping to build port facilities, and India is doing likewise. I mean, the print is too fine for you to see, but you could see the competition if you look up close there. This is from a Council of Foreign Relations report that used the chart. Now, stream of pearls, you could, if you go to extreme, all those stars could be potential naval bases, right? So, but I will, in my concluding remark, that why that's not the case, right? Economic competition also, in a way, China is now the world's largest trading power, surpassing the United States. So everywhere China goes, the country will become, China will become the largest trading partner for those key countries in East Asia, in Southeast Asia, now starting in South Asia as well. I mean, China and the U.S., as far as India is concerned, is number one. Number two, they switch positions. But for most of the time, China has been number one. And certainly Pakistan and Sri Lanka up close, so in the $4 billion range annual bilateral trade. But if you look at in the totality, and certainly the Chinese trade is certainly predominant. But if you look at the investment pattern, well, China is still a newcomer, and so India still dominates. But apart from Pakistan and I think Afghanistan and the rest, India still maintains dominance there. So let me just mention very quickly the China-Sri Lanka relations. I mean, this is a relationship because you can go back 50 years. So next year will be 50 years anniversary, or 60 years anniversary. And they have, in the 70s, certainly when I was in China, we heard a lot about, Mrs. Bandalarak, and the prime minister at the time. And China helped Ceylon at the time. It's called Sri Lanka develop sports stadiums, a lot of public infrastructure. Now, in recent years, China has supported a lot of investment and trade, also expanded. Now they have this strategic cooperative partnership, and then they have also some adjectives to, like, this is a partnership forever, for generations to come. Some modifier there. I find it quite amusing there. Now, investment are in the major port facility that I already mentioned, but defense ties has been very close in terms of Chinese arms trade, conventional arms supplies to Sri Lanka. If you go on the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute website, you can find the data. They have the data set. So the three major customers in South Asia, and Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. And although these are not major weapon system, some patrol boat, tanks, APCs are, armored personnel carriers, and so not the major equipment. Now, Sri Lanka just recently canceled the intention to purchase the C-17, which is a fighter aircraft that jointly developed between China and Pakistan. And certainly the new government in the late 2014, early 2015, the change of government, the new president, Sirasena, when he was running for the president, he mentioned that he would reevaluate a lot of those investment. So when he came into power, he's temporarily suspended quite a number of projects. But these projects now are back on the online because really there are no alternative to funding sources to Chinese investment. Ironically, I think the previous president offered India the port, the Hambantota port, the Indian declined, and then China came in and got the project. So this relationship is getting a little bit more sensitive. So from a very clear pro-China position to a more balanced and certainly not like it was before. I mean, this applies to certainly Myanmar over the last few years, and Bangladesh also as well in recent time. So quickly, there's the BCIM and One Belt One Road, and certainly One Belt One Road came up in the last few years. 2013, Chinese president proposed this in Indonesia APAC meeting. But Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar, this project started as a Track 2 activity, a conference in Kunming, Yunnan province in 1999. But for the last 15 years, basically pretty much stay on the blueprint on paper. Really nothing significant has come to fruition. But they do have a lot of very ambitious plans, and they want to develop these intra-sub-regional area where you have over 400 million people. I mean, it's quite a large population, and want to develop connectivity in terms of transport, flow of people, and trade investment. So this is very important. 2 years ago, they had this Kunming and Calcutta car race, like over 2,000 kilometers, try out the highway, the K2K car. And how is that linked to One Belt, One Road is still too early to tell. I mean, the Indians' assessment, of course, India wanted to develop this land closure area of northeastern part of India, but this is also an area where you have political insurgencies, instability, but also very sensitive area. I mean, as far as security is concerned. So India has not been very forthcoming, hesitant. The last 2 years is a little bit opening up, but whether or not India is fully on board remains to be seen. So here's the BCIM corridor. You can have a visual there. So there's the One Belt, One Road. So the traditional Silk Road, the land route, but the more recently the maritime Silk Road. You can see if you're connecting the dots and from China's Fujian province to Indonesia through Malacca. So there are, Colombo, Sri Lanka there. So going all the way to East and Northern Africa to Europe. So let me conclude. Certainly has been expansion of Chinese economic activities into South Asia. And I don't think there's anything that we should be surprised, because you look at China, everywhere China is expanding, Africa, Latin America. I mean, traditionally, China's East Asia, Southeast Asia, and then Central Asia, Africa, Latin America. And Africa, if you look at Africa would be the continent. Every year in January, Chinese foreign minister would visit several African countries. So that's very important especially when you compare the trade expansion, you'll be amazed how quickly the trade expands between China and all these continents. So this is economic consideration is the priority. But however, I think in the last 15 years, certainly last 10 years, since 2004, when the previous Chinese president Hu Jintao mentioned this, China faces this Strait Malacca dilemma. Is basically China depends so much on Indian Ocean, Strait Malacca. So these are choke points that could strangle China's economic development if these choke points are blocked by hostile states. So therefore, there's rising awareness and consciousness of developing maritime, protecting maritime interests and develop maritime capabilities. So it's not so much about the bases right now, military bases, because China does not have the capacity. But certainly Chinese influence and presence are reaching out those places, places where Chinese maritime vehicles, naval ships can, replenish, repair, stock, and so China wants to gain access to those areas. So the security issues or securitization of economic issues, and certainly put the Indian Ocean on the spot and on China's foreign policy agenda. And there's growing Chinese naval activities. China is part of the anti-piracy mission, Gulf of Aden, and I think for India, these growing military activities, certainly alarm, sound the alarming bell. Their last, I think 2014, because 2 Chinese submarines docked in Sri Lanka, so that was quite a shocking development. But I think for China, the South Asian policy is still being developed, and when China formulate the policy, I think there are probably 3 considerations that will inform the formulation policy. One is what are the importance of South Asia, all these countries as far as China's economic development, security interests are concerned. So these are the first priority. Second is to what extent all these activities should be related to China's relations with India and Pakistan. And so there are 2 ways of thinking about that. And one is, should China be concerned about Indians' reaction so it approach South Asian countries very carefully? Right? Or should China just pursue its own, whatever its interest will dictate, and then try to convince India that this is not a zero-sum, it could be win-win sum outcome. And thirdly, I think is to what extent China's continuing growth in economic power, military power will change China's perception. So China will grow out of East Asia and Southeast Asia and then to venture out further. And so that's, I think these are 3 critical issues. But in the totality of Chinese foreign policy, I think South Asia still remains secondary because there's still the United States, Japan, East Asia, and the Korean Peninsula, and Southeast Asia, South China Sea territorial issues. So I think I've taken too long already, so I'll stop here.
Thank you, Professor Yuan. Paul, maybe 5-10 minutes? Yeah.
Happy to do so, and thank you for inviting me for a return performance a year after my last visit, with many of you but down on the other campus. So it's a treat to be here in your home roost. This is the table where many ideas are being discussed and thought about. And it's a double pleasure because when you had me last time, it was with Raja Mohan, who I've known many years. Actually, I've known today's speaker rather longer, and we did our very best to Canadianize him when he spent some years with us in Toronto and in Vancouver. And I haven't seen him for some years. And it's a treat to get to see how his own mind is developing over time. He has a little bit more gray hair. This is an observation. But he's also been infected by American-style realism after his time in the United States and now in Australia. And I find that he's always been known for doing quite complicated work. He makes one kind of argument, but then there's a sub-theme that's running parallel to it. And this time I'd see it as a take on South Asia from a realist angle, but with a bit of a sub-theme, which is a lot about the new economics and the new texture of South Asia. So it makes it really a treat always to be with you. The idea is a big. And from a person who's interested in China's role in the world, this work is important. We have an enormous amount of material on the China-India relationship. It's been analyzed from 100 different angles, real time. People really have this on their screen. And Pakistan-China relations, a fair amount of work. But as he framed this as China and South Asia, and looking not just at other countries in South Asia, but some of the dynamics in the region, which I'm going to come back to from a slightly different angle than the way you framed it. Nevertheless, looking at that, how China thinks and acts towards a region that may not be the most important in its lineup, but that is important. And any discussion in Beijing with officials, as they look at the world, there's global issues, there's relationship with the United States, and then there are regional issues. And they have very distinctive ways that they look at Northeast Asian dynamics as compared to Southeast Asian, South Asian, and around its periphery. China is not just surrounded by countries, it's surrounded by regions that are part of intersecting sets of interests and activities on a geographical basis. Its approach on Central Asia and terrorism is different than its approach to terrorism as it deals with the South Asian dimension. They overlap, but they're different. So what JD is doing is really of interest, because I haven't seen anybody try to begin, and he's only beginning. He hasn't fleshed this in yet. He has his basic dispositions. So with that, it's important. But let me say a couple of areas of potential discussion from a different angle. The first of them is the very title of this presentation, Introduction to Delhi's Sphere of Influence. In discussions of China and sphere of influence, go to an American group and tell us that China should have a sphere of influence, and watch Americans hit the ceiling. They don't like that when applied. And I don't think many Southeast Asians would appreciate being described as part of China's sphere of influence, nor would Koreans. They would say China is a big, important player. But a sphere of influence has to get pretty close into some ideas around hegemony, dominance, not just one relationship, but an overwhelming relationship. And though I'm a little bit out of date in my time in South Asia, from the years that I lived there in India and Pakistan, I don't think, and traveled a lot to Colombo, I don't think many South Asians would see themselves easily as in an Indian sphere of influence. They might see it as connected to India, or maybe a sphere of opportunity, but it's a framing of this issue that I think comes out of your realist American tradition, even if it doesn't fit the region. So one area for discussion. Yep. Second area for discussion is the maps that were shown. And I thought they were terrific because they were complicated. They didn't look as easy as just the string of pearls, that star map you have. And let me put a different picture in the way that China may be interacting with South Asia, not just country by country, but as a region that's part of geographic proximity to China, but also that is part of a new geoeconomics. And the One Belt, One Road is one way of looking at some of the Chinese thinking. But the reality behind it, when you see those maps up there, what do you see? Do you see supply lines, sea lines of communication? Do you see choke points? Or rather, do you see supply chains? That's what's going on there. Is not just the supply of raw materials to China, but in fact a two-way transfer point of goods going in both directions. So many of our strategic analysts tend to look at the sea lane issue as one that's primarily about supply activities, and oil is what you focus mostly on, going to China. That is part of the picture, unmistakably. But the other part of the picture, and where it gets into discussions of freedom of navigation from a Southeast Asian perspective, is container ships. It's other kinds of a new commerce that is linking certainly Southeast Asia and East Asia in ways that were unimaginable a generation ago. But my hunch is that's beginning to be part of the South Asian game too. So if I'm a president in Colombo, I'm interested in China not just as a source of investment, not just as a place we're going to sell some finished goods to, but I want their investment in particular kinds of manufacturing. I would want them in some kinds of textiles. Bangladesh is the perfect case as an example on this. The Bangladeshi economy is connected to China now, not primarily through trade and simple investment. It's through textile manufacturing, some component parts. And if I'm in different parts of South Asia as a political leader or as an economic leader, I'm going to be looking to China and what it represents in a new economy of global supply chains and a new economy of integration of economies, not just trade between economies. And I think that if we have that kind of picture in our mind, and we then look at those maps, yeah, the PLA is going to be involved in the Navy, and maybe in some ways it shouldn't. But in general terms, it is transforming the ocean territory in a new way. And for Southeast Asians, that comes easily. Everybody knows that the South China Sea is not just about oil movement. It's going to be a lot about a movement of a lot of other goods, and essentially also is a test. And that test is going to be where the second of my 3 points is challenge or at least push JD a little bit further on whether China has a grand strategy. And whether, did you notice at the beginning in the first sentence that he gave today, he talked about China's agenda and agendas, plural. And my hunch, my take on Chinese intentions is that it is multiple agendas. There is indeed a geopolitical one that is playing out, but is only one of them. There is an economic agenda that is somewhat national competition, but is genuinely some of this, what do they call them, positive gains, the win-win stuff. It's a mindset. So as I talk with a lot of Chinese academics and government officials, and I say, what about sphere of influence? Does China need a sphere of influence? Well, no, we don't think so. But we do want a sphere of opportunities. We want a place where we're going to take a lead role in this, but we think there are plus economic games to be played. And in that context, this, from JD's perspective in his paper, why people in Southeast Asia or Northeast Asia are going to be interested in this is because what does it tell us about long-term Chinese intentions? Is this domination in the context of sphere of influence thinking of the 19th and 20th centuries? Or is there something else going on? That Chinese intentions are mixed, that there's a multi-level game going on simultaneously, and that whether economics are in command, politics in command, very difficult to tell, but that that China's agendas include the possibility of some zone of cooperation. Now, and if I put it to our Southeast Asian colleagues here, what is the real China? Is the real China is the assertiveness in the South China Sea, land reclamation, a sovereignty agenda, some elbows, some muscles that are, whether you call it assertive, aggressive, or proactive? Is that the real China? Or is the real China now going to be the one belt, one road China? Is it going to be this quite interesting, new, complex set of economic relationships? And in Southeast Asia, as people look, they see both coming out of China. Which is dominant? And that leads me to my third point and final point. I'm really interested, although it isn't yet developed in the paper, not just the bilateral relations between individual countries and China. And we heard the Sri Lankan example. We heard a lot about India, but hold India and Pakistan aside. We can see bilateral relationships with China. But I'm really kind of interested in what are views of China and what are the interaction points, not just with governments, but with business sector. How are they calculating their interests in Sri Lanka? vis-a-vis? What is public attitudes? How far is China's connection with those other countries in Southeast Asia? And I don't know Bangladesh. It's been a long time since I've been there. But as I see the political economy of Bangladesh changing, I wonder what attitudes are towards the People's Republic of China. And I'm wondering what the level is of interaction. Are there more South Asian students going to China now than there were when I lived in India 20 years ago, when the number was infinitesimal, extremely small? So what I'm getting at is whether you call this a sphere of influence, as you've cut into it, or a sphere of opportunity, what are those other interactions? And if we take Southeast Asia as the example, the interactions with China economically, in geopolitical terms, are going like this. It's a fast line of deeper interactions at multiple societal levels. And I'd hope, JD, as you flesh this in addition to the bilateral, look at the human and the transnational connections in the region. And on that, I'd end with a question that is more just a specific question to you, which has had me rather worried in the last few weeks. If any of you saw Yan Shui-tong's interview, he's a Chinese academic intellectual at Tsinghua University. And Shui-tong gave an interview last week to the New York Times. And in it, he said something kind of, he's always provocative, but he's consistently intelligent. And his line was that the best thing that China should do now is create a formal military alliance with Pakistan. Now, he's an academic. This is not an official government position. But his logic was extraordinary. He said, if we're going to, the Americans are building alliances around us. We're not going to change them. The trend line is against, and in fact, others are sort of counterbalancing us, etc. So why don't we have a full military alliance with Pakistan? Now, the proposal is, you can agree with it or you can see it as rather whimsical. But what was interesting was the second half of that interview, where he was asked, well, why isn't it happening? Why hasn't China decided to go this route, with a possible exception of North Korea? China hasn't gone a sphere of influence, geopolitical route, at least as represented in alliances. His answer was interesting. He said it's purely a habit. He said that China has been so critical of the United States for a Cold War mentality and that kind of attitude, the sphere of influence thinking, et cetera, that their officials back away from it. But JD, if you're wearing your realist hat again, you're going to have to give us an answer to whether Yan Shui-tong has made a good set of advice and why any smart Chinese official wouldn't follow his advice. Just some opening comments to get the discussion going.